So do you guys want to hear something cool? In FGO, the seventh singularity is called Babylonia, and it's set in Mesopotamia during Gilgamesh's time. But here's the funny thing, the chapter puts it in 2655 BC, which is actually smack in the Sumerian era. The real city of Babylon didn't even exist yet. It only popped up around 1800 BC, way later. That's a huge gap. Here's another one. You guys know Gawain, right? One of the Knights of the Round Table. In FGO, he's notoriously only good at cooking mashed potatoes. The hilarious part is, potatoes are actually native to America and didn't even reach Europe until the 16th century. So historically, yeah, that doesn't add up. But let's say we roll with it. Imagine people in that universe seeing Gawain cook mashed potatoes. They'd probably think he's a terrible cook because nobody would even know what the heck that food was supposed to be. Now both of these are interesting, but you know what's the same about them? There's a time placement mistake in both. But honestly, this sort of thing isn't rare at all in FGO. The game is full of stuff that's out of place, things that shouldn't exist in that time or that location, but still show up anyway. And that's basically what we call an anachronism. And trust me, anachronism is a huge part of Fate. That's what I want to talk about today. What anachronism actually is, why it can be good or bad in historical stories like FGO, and some cool examples you might not have noticed. So, what is an anachronism? Well, basically it's when something appears in the wrong time period. Imagine an ancient Norse warrior wearing glasses. That's an easy example, but it's not just objects. It can be how people talk, the music they play, an idea, a type of plant, or even a cultural tradition. If it doesn't belong in that timeline, but still shows up, it's an anachronism. Now you might think, oh, so that means the writer just messed up, right? Maybe they didn't do enough research or couldn't recreate the past accurately. But that's not always the case. This isn't just a modern issue, it goes way back. Take Sir Walter Scott, for example. He was a Scottish author, poet, and historian who wrote tons of historical novels. He's actually considered the guy who first tried to reconstruct the past as something distinct from the present. One of his famous works is Ivanhoe. You see, Scott basically shaped how we imagine the Middle Ages today. But the thing is, Scott mixed stuff up. He threw in clothing and weapons from totally different time periods, exaggerated some historical events, and even wrote in a fake old-timey English that people back then never actually used. But here's the key. These weren't mistakes. Sir Scott did it on purpose. A great example is the character Rebecca, a Jewish heroine in Ivanhoe. Her story doesn't really reflect the Middle Ages. It reflects the struggles of Scott's own era, oppression, exile, and the dream of tolerance. Basically, she carries ideas of hope, humanity, and a better future that didn't exist in the medieval world, but definitely spoke to Scott's readers. So, in a way, Rebecca ends up being kind of a time traveler, not literally, but idea-wise. She represents values that didn't belong to the Middle Ages, but totally connected with modern audiences. And that's the point. Anachronism isn't always about mistakes. Sometimes it's used deliberately to give a story more meaning. Okay, by now you guys should know what anachronism is, the examples, and also the person who probably started it, or at least made it known to the world. Now let's tie it back to FGO. This becomes such an interesting concept because in this series, or in this game, they can make anachronism a big part of it and actually turn it into a benefit. Whether it's for the author or for us, the players. You see, from the story of Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott, we can learn that anachronism can be used to deliver conflicts that feel relatable to readers or the target audience, right? And that's exactly one of the benefits of it in FGO. Well, this works so well because of one thing, the singularity system. The singularity concept gives the authors a kind of storytelling free pass. It's freedom. It's their excuse to bend history and throw in whatever they want, just like how Walter Scott used anachronism to bring in ideas that hit closer to home for his readers. I think that's really interesting. With the singularity system, the authors always have a historical setting to work with. And the writers use these time-bending setups to slip in themes that feel relevant to us, the audience. Since the game and anime mainly target teenagers and young adults, the conflicts are written in a way that's easy to connect with, but also deep enough to make you stop and think. Well, take Aresh in the Babylonia chapter. I'll use the Babylonia chapter as an example because it has an anime. So anyway, her whole story is about wanting recognition and affirmation from ordinary people. That's why she struggles when fighting Fuji, because she wants Fuji to affirm her actions. That's a super relatable struggle for kids these days, right? Or look at the conflict between Gorgon and Quetzalcoatl. Quetz knows that Gorgon isn't actually Tiamat, but still chooses to keep that truth hidden. That's a really layered conflict, and it fits perfectly with the kind of dilemmas young people face, knowing the truth, but deciding whether or not to reveal it. So, yeah, that's one of the benefits, to relate to the readers. But that's not all. There's another benefit they can take. You see, history itself is full of cross-country stories. There are countless tales told one way in one country and another way somewhere else. For example, the story of Siegfried has at least 2 versions, or Indian heroic legends that were adapted into traditional heroic tales in Java and Bali, known as wayang in Indonesia. Even historical records like the Salem witch trials exist in multiple versions. By playing with anachronism inside singularities, the authors can merge one version with another, or even imply connections between them. And that's a genius idea. I'll give you some examples later, so don't leave the video just yet. This benefit is also what sparks heated debates among fans about the plot and such, because theories start popping up whenever something doesn't quite match the era being told. And theory content creators like me can take this even further, since it gives me tons of video ideas. But yeah, I think those 2 things are the biggest benefits of messing up the timeline in historical stories. Now, this kind of thing isn't really a concern anymore, since the singularity system is basically almost gone. We have lost belts, which are whole different worlds with their own rules and histories, and the ordeal call is just a completely different place that we know nothing about, at least for the first one. That's interesting, isn't it? With historical settings, they use the singularity concept to maximize the benefits of anachronism. But once the singularities were done, they moved on to create amazing stories in completely new environments that were introduced to us as we played. I really respect the authors for that. Now, enough of that. I did say I'd show you guys some interesting examples of anachronism in the Fate series, right? Well then, let's get to it. Obviously, I'm not going to point out all of them, just the ones I think are interesting enough. Okay, so the first one I want to point out is Marie Antoinette. Marie actually has 2 noble phantasms, but the one I'm talking about here is the one she used to block John Alter's Berserker army back in the Orleans chapter, Crystal Palace. In the manga, this noble phantasm is shown as a barrier-type move. Just like the name suggests, it creates these massive crystal walls to protect an area and also boosts the abilities of whoever's inside. Pretty cool, right? Now here's the interesting part. Marie's noble phantasm is called Crystal Palace, but the real Crystal Palace is in the United Kingdom, and it was built almost 50 years after her execution. So, yeah. Kind of funny if you think about it, because I don't think there's any real connection between the Crystal Palace and Marie. At least, not directly. Of course, we can just say it's a coincidence in naming. After all, her Crystal Palace doesn't really look like the historical one. But if we take it as intentional, then maybe it's just another way of showing how broad Marie's love and influence really are. Let's move on to the next one. It's about the outfit. You see, some of these heroic spirits sometimes have outfits that don't reflect their actual era or time period at all. Earlier, I mentioned Sigurd wearing glasses. Now, let's take another example. Saito Hajime has a really cool outfit. Long coat, suit, gloves. It looks awesome. But here's the thing. He lived in 19th century Japan. Well, I guess suits did exist in the 19th century, but in Japan, I feel like it would still be about 100 years too early for that kind of clothing to be common. Yes, that's one of his outfits, and he does have a traditional Japanese one too. But in Fujimaru's dreams of Saito's past, he's shown wearing his first Ascension outfit, which doesn't really make sense. This also happens with William Tell, by the way. Even though he comes from a 14th century legend, he shows up in what looks like pretty realistic modern military gear, and his repeating compound crossbow is basically styled like an assault rifle. At least with him, it actually gets acknowledged and explained in his room dialogue, where he straight up says it's important to keep up with the latest tech, even if it didn't exist in his own time. Honestly, I'm still not totally sure how the outfit thing really works though. This kind of anachronism can be spotted everywhere, so whatever. I mean, you can see a Roman Empire general wearing a necktie, a writer from old Japan in a Victorian dress and all that. But there's one character whose anachronism I think is deliberately designed to confuse us. Now honestly, for characters like Sigurd, Tell, or Saito, the anachronism in their designs feels like it's just the artist wanting to make them look cool. Later, they can always tie it back to the lore if needed. But for this one character, I feel like the priority was to make her confusing. That's Abigail Williams. Why do I say her design feels like it's deliberately confusing? Well, because of her main story, the Salem Witch Trials. If you've played the chapter, you probably know what I mean. Salem itself is confusing. Not the gameplay, but the atmosphere. You can't really pinpoint the exact place or time where the singularity happened, and Abby is there to trick you so you don't see through the truth. Now, what I want to point out is that there are a few elements of her, mostly her appearance, that really trip the anachronism alarm. She's not exactly accurate to where she's supposed to be from. Let's start with her normal outfit. You see, it's full of tied bow ornaments, in different colors too. At first, this might seem natural, especially since Abby is a kid, but it's actually wrong for the time period. In the 17th century, bows were used for functionality, to tie sashes, not as hair accessories or clothing decorations. Meanwhile, Abby is just straight up covered in bows purely for decoration. That's the first one. Next is her dress. It's cut much higher up the leg than would have been acceptable in Salem at the time, especially for a child. On top of that, her hat is also out of place. It looks like a bowler hat. Why is this wrong for the time period? Because that style of hat wouldn't even exist for another 150 years. It was also unusual for women to wear hats like that at all, unless they were horseback riding. I didn't even notice how off this was until I compared Abby's outfit to the other Salem girls and women. Most of them wear scarves on their heads, which was way more accurate for the time. That's what she should have looked like. And then there's her teddy bear. Now you might think there's nothing wrong with that, but actually, teddy bears didn't exist back then. While soft toys weren't completely unknown in Abigail's time, bear dolls like the ones she has, and shares with Lavinia, which is honestly really cute, didn't appear until the early 20th century. So that's another big question mark for anyone who notices details like this. Finally, there's the fact that she sings "Happy Birthday to You" if it's your birthday. While it's absolutely adorable, it's also completely out of place. You see, that song didn't exist until around 1893, and it only became popular in the 20th century. So that's also an anachronism. Well, I guess the situational awareness of the time a servant is summoned is also a factor in Abby's birthday song. But it's still an interesting thing to think about. Now, okay, almost forgot. I want to give you an example of anachronism that actually benefits from adapting one history into another. I'll just give you one, since this video's already pushing 15 minutes. Maybe I'll cover more another time, but for now you can dig up the rest yourself. Remember when Circe appeared in Salem? Circe showing up in Salem during a historically documented event is technically an anachronism that's only possible because of the singularity system. At first, you might think the writers just threw her in there for no reason. But then you discover that Tituba, a real-life figure from the Salem Witch Trials, actually has a connection. I'm talking about the more realistic version of the Salem Witch Trials, because, you know, there are different versions of it. People tend to exaggerate things. See, Tituba was a slave owned by Samuel Parris, the minister of Salem Village. In the real story, she was implied to have been tortured by her owner and forced to confess that she was a witch. From there, she accused 2 other women and said things that made no logical sense, like seeing a black dog, a bird, and other strange visions. One of the things she described was a head of a woman, 2 legs, and wings. And surprisingly, that description fits Cersei almost perfectly. That's crazy, isn't it? So it seems the writers deliberately placed Cersei in Salem to follow that thread of the historical event, tying in another version, or rather, a more detailed interpretation of the Salem story. The game's story doesn't tell you this, so you might not know it. But if you read the more realistic documents of the Salem trials, you'll find this interesting connection. So yeah, that's about it. What do you guys think? It's not really about right or wrong, it's just cool how FGO can take this and make it even more interesting. Anyway, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you guys next time.